On May 9, 1932, a New Jersey State Police lieutenant entered the National Bureau of Standards in Washington carrying the original ransom notes from the Lindbergh kidnapping. Inside the building, he was introduced as Mr. Martin of New York. The investigation itself was disguised as the Adamson case, supposedly a bank failure involving federal interests. Behind these precautions waited Wilmer Souder, a physicist known publicly for measuring dental fillings. He would photograph the notes, compare their writing, and lock the negatives in a government vault. Within months, he would also advise the small Federal Bureau building a crime laboratory of its own. How did a specialist in precision measurement become an unseen architect of questioned document examination, and why did the record of his work almost disappear? Souder had arrived at the National Bureau of Standards in 1911 after studying physics at Indiana University and briefly teaching school. In 1913, he left for doctoral work at the University of Chicago, where the physics faculty included Albert Michelson and Robert Millikan. His dissertation concerned the photoelectric effect, a subject demanding disciplined experiments and careful treatment of small differences. He received his doctorate in 1916 and returned to the Federal Bureau in 1917. There, precision was not an abstraction. The agency existed to make measurements dependable across government and industry. Souder studied how dental amalgams expanded and contracted, work important to military dentistry, and later honored by a major dental research award bearing his name. His second career began with the same habit: make the comparison visible, repeatable, and defensible. Early in Souder's federal career, the document examiner Albert S. Osborne sent precision instruments to the Bureau of Standards for calibration. Osborne's field asked whether a signature was genuine, whether one typewriter produced a page, or whether several anonymous letters came from one hand. To Souder, these were measurement problems. A letter could be enlarged and its proportions compared. Ink, paper, indentation, spacing, and the repeated construction of characters could be examined instead of guessed at. The same laboratory culture served his dental work and his forensic work. Control the conditions, preserve the specimen, and distinguish observation from conclusion. By the 1920s, federal departments were bringing him handwriting, typewriting, bullets, cartridge cases, and firearms. The government had no central federal crime laboratory, so the Standards Bureau quietly acted as one. From 1929 onward, Souder logged his forensic assignments in compact notebooks. The surviving entries record 838 cases through 1954, with requests from agencies concerned with forged checks, stolen securities, extortion letters, firearms, and disputed government records. Nearly 300 came from the Treasury Department and almost 100 from the Department of Justice. By the early 1930s, he was participating in roughly 50 to 75 federal investigations a year. This was not a separate national police force hidden inside a science agency. It was a measurement service responding to evidence that other departments could not examine for themselves. Souder also argued publicly for minimum standards in laboratory equipment and for meaningful qualifications among expert witnesses. Before the federal government had a permanent crime lab, he was already asking what such a lab would need to deserve a Quarta Euro-esque confidence. The case that exposed the need for permanent forensic capacity began near Hopewell, New Jersey on March 1, 1932. Charles Lindbergh's 20-month-old son was taken from a second-floor nursery. A homemade ladder, a chisel, and a note demanding $50,000 were found at the property. No usable fingerprints were developed, and footprints in the wet ground were lost amid the traffic around the scene. More messages followed. Their unusual spelling, letter forms, and repeated symbol made the paper itself a line of inquiry. New Jersey State Police retained jurisdiction, while federal agencies and outside specialists offered assistance. With no state police laboratory available, Lieutenant Russell A. Snook carried the original documents to Washington. Souder-8's assignment was narrow but fundamental: preserve what the writer had left and determine whether the notes shared a common source. The surviving police report describes work completed from May 7th through May 13th. 14 ransom notes, 11 envelopes, a brown wrapper, and a reference key assembled from the writing were photographed. Enlarged sets were prepared for comparison. Snook sealed the photographic and photostatic negatives, then placed them in the Standards vault. Souder and his colleague Raymond Davis also studied the colored symbol on the notes. They reported that its larger circles appeared consistent with the top of an ink bottle cork and its smaller circle with the bottom of another cork. More important, Souder concluded that the submitted notes had been written by the same individual. He recommended that other examiners collaborate, specifically Osborne. Secrecy protected the originals, but independent opinions were meant to test the conclusion rather than merely repeat it. Souder-'s first conclusion identified one writer, not a named suspect. The harder task was exclusion. At the request of George R. Dye, secretary to the late Senator Dwight Morrow, The Bureau of Standards examined handwriting on approximately 8,000 documents held in the Senate Office Building. A June 3rd letter reported no agreement with the ransom writing. Over the next 2.5 years, more requested samples and possible writings reached Souder. At trial, he estimated that he had personally reviewed between 8,000 and 10,000 documents. This scale matters because questioned document work is not a search for one dramatic resemblance. A common shape may be common to thousands of writers. The examiner looks for a recurring combination of habits, then asks whether meaningful differences can be reconciled. For years, the Adamson file produced elimination after elimination. While Souder worked at the Standards Bureau, Special Agent Charles Appel was pressing the Bureau of Investigation to create its own facility. Appel had studied scientific crime detection in Chicago and gathered advice, articles, equipment catalogs, and contacts. On July 7, 1932, he proposed a separate unit that could contain a criminological research laboratory. Director J. Edgar Hoover approved the idea. Souder served as an outside scientific advisor, helping with planning, equipment, and the training of laboratory personnel. The distinction is important. Appel founded and operated the Bureau laboratory. Souder supplied experience accumulated before it existed. Their roles met at a practical question. What should an examiner require before offering an opinion about a page, a bullet, or a tool mark? The answer had to fit inside a federal office and still withstand a courtroom. By September 14th, Appel reported that room 802 of Washington Euro S old Southern Railway building was ready. The equipment included an ultraviolet light, photographic supplies, chemicals, impression kits, and a microscope on loan while its purchase was processed. A device for inspecting gun barrels was on order. The room had previously served Identification Division employees as a break room, and Appel even found a spare carpet and ordered cabinets. November 24th, 1932, became the Laboratory Euro SS official opening date, although the surviving memoranda show that work was already underway. Initially called the Criminology Laboratory, it began with Appel as its single employee and focused heavily on questioned documents. The first year brought nearly 1,000 examinations. A modest room had turned scientific assistance from an improvised outside service into a standing federal function. The Lindbergh notes became one of the new Laboratory Euro S earliest and most demanding assignments. Appel compared them with writing from about 300 suspects without a match. The break came through money, not penmanship. A service station attendant recorded a license number on a $10 gold certificate used to buy gasoline. The certificate came from the ransom payment, and the registration led investigators to Bruno Richard Hauptmann, a carpenter living in the Bronx. He was arrested on September 19, 1934. More than $13,000 in ransom certificates were found at his property, and handwriting specimens were flown to Washington. FBIâ Euro S laboratory compared those specimens with the ransom notes and reported significant similarities. Souder conducted his own examination for the New Jersey prosecution. At last, the question writing had a known name against which it could be tested. Souder testified in Flemington on January 16, 1935. He was one of 8 questioned document experts called by the prosecution and the only one employed by the federal government. The examiners had been directed to work independently. Souder told the court that, in his opinion, Hauptmann wrote the ransom notes. Under cross-examination, he said he had examined about 30 writings attributed to Hauptmann and thousands of other documents during the investigation. Asked about discrepancies, he defined them as differences that could not be reconciled and said he had found none. The handwriting evidence was only part of the case. Prosecutors also presented traced ransom money, testimony concerning the ransom contact, and evidence connecting Hauptmann Euro S tools and attic wood to the latter. On February 13th, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder. He was executed on April 3, 1936. The verdict closed the prosecution, but it did not make every scientific claim timeless. In 1936, Souder described an immense numerical factor of certainty for his handwriting conclusion. The calculation behind that figure has not survived, so it cannot be audited and should not be repeated as a measured error rate. Modern reviews have said there may be a scientific basis for comparing handwriting while also warning that the reliability of conclusions and the frequency of error require empirical study. Souder himself had called for qualified experts, adequate instruments, and standards before the trial. That makes his legacy more complicated and more useful. He helped professionalize a subjective field. Yet the record does not allow modern readers to reconstruct every step of his most famous analysis. Evidence can be persuasive in its own time and still require limits in the language used to describe it. Souder retired in 1954, and without an understudy, the National Bureau of Standards left forensic casework. His quiet methods also obscured his importance. Detailed reports concerning handwriting, typewriting, and bullet identification had been discarded from the Federal Archive in April 1944. Then, late in 2014, a NIST museum curator found 9 green notebooks filled with his compact handwriting. In November 2015, researchers at the National Archives opened an old box and found 2 smaller boxes sealed with black tape. They contained Pseudo-Euro-esque glass negatives of the Lindbergh ransom notes. The missing Adamson volume has not been found. Yet the surviving police report explains why Lieutenant Snook became Mr. Martin, why the kidnapping became a bank failure, and why the originals entered a vault. The disguise survived because the public record survived it. A questioned document helped solve a case. The documents that remain later restored the examiner himself.